Hey everyone. Today's story is a little close to the heart, about trust, betrayal, and finding the strength to start over. If you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to subscribe and join me for more. I stepped through the metal gates of Danbury Federal Correctional Institution with a paper bag containing everything I still owned. One pair of jeans that hung loose on my hips, a faded blue blouse I'd worn to my sentencing, undergarments, and $57 in cash. The guard didn't say goodbye. He just buzzed me through and turned away, already forgetting my face. The spring air hit my skin like something alive. 2 years inside made everything outside seem unnaturally bright, unnaturally wide. Birds made noise in trees I couldn't name. Cars passed on a road that seemed too fast, too close. My lungs pulled in air that tasted different. No institutional cleaner, no body odor, no desperation. I clutched my release papers and bus ticket, my fingernails digging into the thin paper. The parking lot stretched out before me, heat rising off the asphalt in wavy lines. My parents' car waited at the far end, a beige sedan that looked smaller than I remembered. My father got out first. He wore the same windbreaker he'd had for 20 years, khaki pants pressed with a sharp crease. He'd aged. New lines cut across his forehead, and his hair had gone completely gray at the temples. He raised his hand in an awkward half-wave, then dropped it to his side. "Emily," he said. Not honey or sweetheart like before. Just my name. My mother stayed in the passenger seat until I was 10 feet away. Then she emerged, smoothing her slacks, adjusting her blouse. She'd had her hair cut into a severe bob that made her face look pinched. Her lips pressed together in what might have been a smile if you didn't know better. "You look thin," she said. Her eyes darted to my face, then away. I didn't answer. There was no point explaining prison food or how hunger becomes background noise after a while. I slid into the back seat like a child, my paper bag balanced on my lap. The door closed with a solid thunk that made me flinch. We drove in silence for 20 minutes before my father cleared his throat. We cleaned out your old room. There's fresh sheets." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Your mother made meatloaf for dinner." "I'm not staying," I said. The words came out harder than I meant them to. My mother's shoulders stiffened. "What do you mean? I've got a place in New Haven, a studio. I'd arranged it through a prison social worker, the only person who seemed to believe I was innocent. I start there tomorrow." "New Haven?" My father's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "That's an hour away. How will you—" "I can manage." I watched the highway signs flash past, exits to places I'd never been. "I need to start fresh." My mother turned halfway in her seat, her seatbelt straining across her chest. "Emily, be reasonable. You don't have a job. You don't have—" "I have my savings. What was left of them after Ethan's defense attorney fees and the apartment deposit. And I have interviews lined up. A lie, but a necessary one." "People will ask questions," my mother said. Her voice dropped to that half-whisper she used when discussing anything uncomfortable. Illness, money problems, my conviction. "About where you've been." What she meant was, your shame might splash onto us. "That's why I'm leaving Hartford." I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. Fields and buildings blurred together. "I've already filed to change my name." That made my father slam on the brakes, earning us a honk from the car behind. "You what?" "I'm changing it to Collins. Emily Collins. My mother's maiden name. An olive branch she didn't deserve, but I needed something familiar to hold on to." "You can't just—" my father started. "I already did." The rest of the drive passed in silence, broken only by the radio announcer discussing weather and traffic. My mother twisted her wedding ring around and around her finger. My father took the Hartford exit, then followed my directions to the bus station. "We could drive you," he offered as he pulled into a parking space. "No." I gathered my paper bag. "This is better." My mother reached back awkwardly, her hand hovering near mine but not quite touching. "When will we see you?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The question in her eyes wasn't about when, it was about if she'd ever see me again. If I could forgive her for doubting me, if she could forgive herself. "I'll call when I'm settled," I said. Another lie. They didn't get out of the car. I didn't look back as I walked into the station, bought a bottle of water with my prison money, and boarded the bus to New Haven. The seat felt too soft after prison bunks. The driver nodded at me, bored and indifferent. Freedom felt like falling with no ground in sight. My studio apartment was 14 steps across and 12 steps wide. I walked it off my first night there, counting each footfall on the cracked linoleum. The walls were off-white, scrubbed clean but still bearing shadows where previous tenants had hung pictures. A twin mattress on a metal frame, a 2-burner stove, a refrigerator that hummed too loudly, a bathroom with a shower stall so small I had to soap up in sections. It was perfect. No memories lived here. I bought secondhand dishes from a thrift store, a lamp with a crooked shade, a folding table that wobbled unless I wedged a matchbook under one leg. I didn't buy pictures or plants or anything that would need attention while I was gone. Nothing I couldn't leave behind if I had to run. The first week, I walked downtown every morning with printed resumes on cheap paper. I wore my one good outfit, black pants and a button-up shirt I'd found at Goodwill, and repeated the same conversation in each place. "I see you have a gap in your work history," the manager at the bookstore said, tapping my resume with her pen. "I was caring for a sick relative," I told her. The lie came easier each time. "And your degree in finance? Seems like you're overqualified." "I'm looking for something stable while I figure out my next step." She didn't call back. Neither did the grocery store, the library, or the department store. My parole officer, a tired man named Mr. Gaines with coffee stains on his tie, gave me leads that led nowhere. "Be patient," he said during our weekly meeting, rubber stamping my paperwork without looking at it. "Something will come up." By the third week, my savings had dwindled to dangerous levels. I expanded my search radius, walking an extra mile each direction. My shoes wore thin, my feet blistered, popped, and calloused. I ate ramen noodles and counted quarters for laundry money. Then I found Maple Street Cafe. It sat on a corner 2 blocks from campus, its green awning faded by sun. A handwritten sign in the window, "Help wanted, no experience necessary." The owner, Rita, had gray-streaked hair pulled into a messy bun and hands roughened by decades of food service. She took my resume, glanced at it, then set it aside. "Ever worked in a cafe before?" "No." "Can you count change without a machine?" "Yes." "Can you start tomorrow? 5 a.m. shift." I blinked. "Don't you need to run a background check?" Rita shrugged one shoulder. "You got a record?" My mouth went dry. "Yes." "Violent?" "No, financial fraud, but I didn't." She held up her hand. "Not my business. Show up on time, don't steal from the register, be decent to customers, that's all I care about." I started the next morning. Rita showed me how to operate the espresso machine, how to stack cups so they wouldn't fall, how to deal with the rush of students and professors needing caffeine before early classes. By the end of my shift, my feet ached and coffee grounds had embedded themselves under my fingernails. But I had a job, a legitimate paycheck, a starting point. 6 months passed. I settled into routine, morning shifts at the cafe, online classes in accounting at night. I was trying to reclaim what Ethan had stolen from me. Not just my freedom, but my profession, my confidence, my name, though that remained legally changed. The apartment stayed bare. No photos on the refrigerator, no postcards, no souvenirs. When my first paycheck came, I bought blackout curtains and a better lock for the door. When the second came, I started a new savings account at a different bank, using my new name. Small steps toward security. I worked extra shifts whenever Rita offered them. The cafe became familiar territory, the rush of the morning crowd, the slower pace of afternoons, the rhythm of brewing and serving and cleaning. I learned which regulars took their coffee black and which needed exact amounts of cream and sugar. I memorized orders and faces but kept conversations minimal. "You don't talk much about yourself," Rita said one afternoon as we cleaned up after closing. "Not much to tell," I replied, wiping down tables with careful, methodical strokes. "Everyone's got a story," I shrugged. "Mine's boring." Rita didn't push. That's why I stayed. She asked no questions, demanded no explanations, seemed content to judge me only on the work I did now, not the person I'd been before. At night, I took online courses through a community college. Intermediate accounting, business ethics, corporate finance. The irony wasn't lost on me, studying the very systems Ethan had manipulated to frame me. But I needed to understand exactly how he'd done it. Knowledge was protection. I watched the customers at the cafe with new awareness. The professor who flirted with students when his wedding ring was in his pocket. The businessman who made calls in angry whispers when he thought no one could hear. The woman who came in different clothes each day, but always wore the same anxious expression. I cataloged their tells, their contradictions, the gaps between who they presented themselves to be and who they really were. My parole officer said I was doing well. "You've got stable housing, steady employment, you're furthering your education." He checked items off a list during our monthly meeting. "You're a model case, Emily." I nodded and smiled appropriately. He didn't need to know about the nightmares that still woke me, about how I flinched when men in suits came into the cafe, about how I'd memorized 3 different escape routes from my apartment building. On my off days, I walked the streets of New Haven, learning the city that was now mine. Yale's campus with its stone buildings and hurrying students, the harbor with its mix of industrial grit and attempted renewal. I walked until my legs ached, until sweat ran down my back, until I was too tired to think. One night, I stood in my apartment and recognized the truth. I wasn't living. I was existing, surviving, building walls and checking exits and trusting nothing and no one. And that was exactly how it needed to be. I looked at the sparse room, bed made with hospital corners, dishes washed and put away, textbooks stacked by size, order imposed on chaos. My choice, not someone else's. Trust no one wasn't just a mantra. It was the only lesson worth learning from what Ethan had done to me. People showed you what they wanted you to see. They got close to use you, to take what they needed, to make you their scapegoat when things went wrong. I would never be that person again, the trusting fool who believed in love and loyalty. The woman who signed papers without reading the fine print because Ethan asked her to. The convenient fall guy when the charity's money disappeared. I pulled the blackout curtains closed against the New Haven night. Tomorrow I would pour coffee and smile at strangers and say nothing that mattered. Tomorrow I would continue rebuilding with no foundation except my own determination. Tomorrow I would remember what prison taught me. The only person you can count on is yourself. I turned out the light and lay down on my narrow bed, listening to the sounds of my new life. The refrigerator's hum, water running through pipes, a neighbor's muffled music, not prison sounds, not home sounds either. Just temporary noises in a temporary life. Tuesday mornings brought the rush of students late for 8 a.m. classes, hair still wet from showers, eyes puffy with sleep, phones clutched like life preservers as they ordered coffee to survive lectures. I kept the line moving with practiced efficiency, calling orders to Rita, while the espresso machine hissed and spat behind me. "Medium dark roast, room for cream," I announced, sliding the cup across the counter without looking up. "Thanks, Emily." The voice was deeper than I expected, with a cadence that didn't match the hurried student crowd. I glanced up. Lucas Gray stood on the other side of the counter, his weathered messenger bag slung over one shoulder. Same horn-rimmed glasses, same slightly rumpled button-down with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He claimed the corner table every Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 7:30 a.m., as reliable as the ancient wall clock that hung over the pastry case. "Avocado toast?" I asked, already knowing the answer. 3 months of his twice-weekly visits had burned his routine into my memory. "Please." He smiled, dropping $1 into the tip jar before moving to his usual spot. The thing about Lucas Gray that I noticed first wasn't his appearance. It was his absence, the absence of a phone in his hand. While every other customer scrolled through screens, Lucas sat with a leather-bound notebook open before him, writing in neat, compact handwriting, occasionally looking up to observe the cafe or gaze out the window. When his food arrived, he set his pen down completely. "Here you go." I placed his plate on the table, noting the crumbs from yesterday's customers I'd missed during closing. "Sorry about the mess." "No mess." He closed his notebook. "How's your morning going so far?" Most customers who asked that question were already reaching for their phones or turning away. The words just empty space between silence and receiving their order. Lucas waited, eyes focused on my face, as if my answer might actually matter. "Busy." I offered my standard response, then found myself adding, "But good. One of the regulars brought in muffins she baked, blueberry almond. There might be one left if you're interested. Maybe after the toast." He tapped his pen against the table, a light rhythm that didn't quite match the indie folk music Rita played every morning. "You look tired. Tuesday shifts always this rough?" The observation threw me. I'd learned to manage my expressions, to keep the exhaustion of night classes and recurring nightmares hidden beneath a layer of practiced pleasantness. I took a small step back. "We're short-staffed," I said, my voice cooling. "Enjoy your breakfast." I returned to the counter, busying myself with the next wave of customers. From the corner of my eye, I saw Lucas return to his writing, apparently unbothered by my withdrawal. That was another Lucas Gray peculiarity. He never pushed. When I gave short answers or changed the subject, he simply accepted the boundary and moved on. No sulking, no pressing, just quiet acknowledgement. For the next hour, I steamed milk and made change and called out orders. The morning rush ebbed, leaving just a few scattered customers typing on laptops or reading textbooks. Lucas remained in his corner, now on his second cup of coffee. "Mind a refill?" I asked, coffee pot in hand, during my table check. "Please." He pushed his cup toward me, closing his notebook. "I'm working on a piece about pharmaceutical price fixing, not exactly light breakfast reading. What kind of journalist specializes in making enemies of large corporations?" I poured the coffee, careful to leave room for the splash of cream he sometimes added later. "The kind with job security." A half smile appeared. "Corporate corruption doesn't exactly solve itself." "Seems depressing," I said, wiping a drop of coffee from the table. "Learning how people cheat the system day after day. Sometimes," he leaned back in his chair, "but occasionally someone gets caught and actually pays for it. Those days make the rest worthwhile." I nodded and started to move to the next table when he asked, "What about you? What makes your days worthwhile?" The question caught me unprepared. What made my days worthwhile? Survival, building savings, creating distance from my past, none of which I could share. "Free day-old pastries," I finally said, lifting one shoulder in a small shrug. His laugh was genuine, crinkling the corners of his eyes behind his glasses. "Fair enough, though I suspect there's more to you than a weakness for stale danishes." "Not much more," I replied, my standard defense when customers got curious. "Just your average coffee slinger with student loans." Rain began to tap against the windows, light at first, then in sheets that blurred the world outside. The cafe took on that peculiar hush that comes with bad weather. People huddling inside, reluctant to brave the downpour. Lucas stayed longer than usual, the remains of his toast growing cold as he wrote in his notebook. When the rain finally slowed to a drizzle, the cafe had emptied except for Lucas and an elderly man dozing over a paperback by the door. I collected abandoned mugs and wiped down tables, the mindless rhythm of cleaning, letting my thoughts wander. "You don't talk much about yourself." Lucas's voice broke through my routine. I looked up to find him watching me, pen poised over his notebook. I hadn't realized how close I'd come to his table in my cleaning circuit. "Not much to tell," I said, wringing excess water from my rag into a bucket. "Everyone has a story." The echo of Rita's words from months ago made something in my chest tighten. I focused on scrubbing a stubborn coffee ring. "Mine's boring. What about that pharmaceutical piece? Find anything breaking yet?" He accepted the deflection with a small nod, but I caught something in his eyes, not suspicion, just curiosity. It made me both uncomfortable and oddly seen. "They're hiding price manipulation inside shell companies," he said. "Classic strategy, but they got sloppy with the paperwork." "Shell companies need maintenance like anything else," I replied without thinking. "Their mistake was probably trying to manage too many layers of separation without enough oversight." His eyebrows rose slightly. "That's exactly right. You know something about corporate finance?" My hands stilled on the table. I'd slipped, letting knowledge from my past life leak into conversation. "Just what I've picked up from news articles," I lied, "plus some business classes." "You have a good eye for it." He closed his notebook and slipped it into his messenger bag. "Thanks for letting me camp out during the storm." "That's what we're here for," I said, relieved he hadn't pushed further. "See you Thursday?" "Wouldn't miss it." He left his usual generous tip and headed for the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. "If you're ever interested in hearing more about the pharmaceutical case, I'd be happy to talk shop somewhere you're not working." My automatic refusal caught in my throat. The invitation was casual, professional rather than personal. Just two people discussing something of mutual interest. Not a date, not a risk. "Maybe," I said, surprising myself. "I'll think about it." He nodded once and stepped out into the damp afternoon. October brought falling leaves and earlier sunsets. The trees lining Maple Street flamed red and gold, dropping their bounty onto sidewalks and against the cafe windows. Students huddled inside, ordering pumpkin-spiced everything and complaining about midterms. Lucas continued his Tuesday-Thursday routine, but our conversation stretched longer with each visit. "Try this one," he said one morning, placing a paperback next to my elbow as I wiped down the counter. The author spent 5 years tracking money laundering through European art markets. Reads like a thriller. I examined the book, careful not to get the cover wet. I'm not sure when I'd have time to read it. Keep it as long as you need. It took me 3 months to finish between deadlines. He pushed it closer. No pressure. I slid the book into my apron pocket, oddly touched by the gesture. Thanks. I walk home through East Rock Park sometimes. Might be good company. You like the park? The view from the summit is worth the climb this time of year. I've only gone partway up. My apartment's on the opposite side, so I usually cut through the lower trails. You're missing out. He took a sip of his coffee. The whole city spreads out below you at sunset. All those problems seem smaller from up there. I found myself reading his book that night, curled on my twin bed with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders as the radiator clinked and struggled to warm my small apartment. The author's detailed explanation of how criminals moved money through art auctions was fascinating, but more interesting was the note Lucas had left on a slip of paper tucked inside the cover. Thought you might appreciate the financial analysis in Chapter 4. The part about invoice manipulation reminded me of our shell company conversation. He'd paid attention to what interested me. The realization was both warming and concerning. 2 days later, I handed the book back, dog-eared at Chapter 7. You were right about the financial analysis. His breakdown of the auction house's tracking systems was impressive. Lucas's face brightened. You're already at Chapter 7? It took me weeks to get that far. I don't sleep much, I admitted, then quickly added, lots of readings for my online classes. What are you studying? Accounting. Another small truth I rarely shared. Just brushing up on skills. Smart field, always in demand. He tucked the book into his bag. Have you made it to the summit at East Rock yet? No time this week. Extra shifts. He nodded, fingers tapping lightly on his coffee mug. If you wanted company for that hike sometime, let me know. No obligation. The old warning bells rang faintly in my head, but they seemed distant, muffled by months of Lucas's consistent presence and respectful boundaries. Still, I hesitated. Just as hiking buddies, he added, perhaps sensing my reluctance. The park trails can get tricky if you don't know them well. Maybe next week, I found myself saying. Tuesday afternoon, I have the evening off. His smile came quick and genuine. Tuesday works. Meet here after your shift? I nodded, already wondering if I'd regret the decision. Tuesday arrived with perfect fall weather. Crisp air, cloudless sky, just enough breeze to send leaves spiraling from branches. Lucas appeared at the cafe door precisely when my shift ended, 2 travel mugs in hand. Hope you don't mind, he said, offering one to me. I picked these up from the place around the corner. Figured you might be tired of making coffee all day. The mug was warm against my palms. I took a sip, just the right amount of cream, no sugar. He'd remembered from the few times I'd made a drink for myself during shifts he'd been present. Thanks. I pulled my jacket closer as we headed toward the park. I've been looking forward to getting outside. The path into East Rock Park climbed gently at first, winding between trees ablaze with autumn colors. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, releasing their earthy scent with each step. We walked in companionable silence for several minutes, the sounds of the city falling away behind us. So why journalism? I asked, stepping over a tree root that bulged across the path. Specifically investigative work. Lucas took a moment before answering, his pace steady beside mine. My father lost everything to a Ponzi scheme when I was in high school. Guy named Wexler convinced half our town to invest in his guaranteed return fund. What happened? What always happens? His voice remained even, but I caught the underlying tension. Money disappeared. Wexler tried to flee. Got caught eventually, but the damage was done. My college fund? Gone. My parents' retirement? Gone. They had to sell our house? Start over in their 50s. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. Did they recover? Somewhat. Dad never really trusted anyone again. He glanced at me, a shadow of understanding passing between us. I decided in college that exposing these operations before they destroyed lives was something worth doing. I nodded, recognizing the drive to make meaning from loss. We continued up the trail as it grew steeper, requiring more breath for climbing and less for talking. The trees thinned as we ascended, offering glimpses of the city below. At the summit, New Haven spread out before us, Yale's Gothic spires, the grid of downtown streets, the harbor in the distance reflecting the afternoon sun. We sat on a bench facing the view, our breath forming small clouds in the cooling air. Worth the climb? Lucas asked. Worth it, I agreed, taking in the panorama. From this height, my small life seemed part of something larger, connected to the city below rather than hiding within it. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and orange, Lucas pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, different from his work journal, more worn around the edges. "Mind if I jot something down? This view is giving me ideas for the conclusion of my article." "Go ahead," I said, sipping the last of my now cool coffee. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the scratch of his pen against paper joining the rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I watched the sunlight gilding the city buildings, turning ordinary brick and concrete into something almost beautiful. "You mentioned your finance degree before," Lucas said without looking up from his writing. "Did you work in the field before the cafe?" My muscles tensed slightly. I'd mentioned my degree exactly once, months ago in passing. He'd remembered and connected it to my current accounting studies. For a while, I kept my voice neutral. It didn't work out. "Seems like a waste of your knowledge," he said, still writing. "The financial insight you mentioned about shell companies was spot on, the kind of perspective that comes from experience, not just classes." "I'm satisfied with where I am now," I said, standing up. "We should head back before it gets dark." Lucas nodded, closing his notebook. As he slipped it back into his pocket, I caught a glimpse of the page, not article notes as I'd assumed, but what looked like a timeline with dates and names. "Sorry if I struck a nerve," he said as we started down the trail. "Professional habit to ask too many questions." "It's fine." My mind raced, calculating what other information I might have inadvertently shared over the past months. I just don't like dwelling on the past. We descended mostly in silence, the earlier ease between us replaced with a subtle tension I couldn't address without revealing more than I wanted to. At the base of the trail, where the path forked toward different parts of the city, I stopped. "I can find my way from here," I said, gesturing toward the eastern fork. "Thanks for the coffee and the company." Lucas studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks for showing me your favorite park. Maybe we could do it again sometime? There's a good trail in Sleeping Giant State Park if you're ever interested." "Maybe," I said noncommittally. "I should get home. Early shift tomorrow." "Of course." He hesitated, then added, "I enjoyed this, Emily. No pressure for a repeat, but the invitation stands." I offered a small smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Good night, Lucas." Back in my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and sat cross-legged on my bed, opening my laptop. The search bar blinked at me, waiting. I typed, "Lucas Gray, Hartford Courier." His professional profile appeared first: Harvard Journalism School graduate, award-winning investigative reporter specializing in financial crimes and corporate fraud. I clicked through to his article archive, scanning headlines. "Pension fund mismanagement leaves retirees destitute." "Healthcare fraud scheme uncovered." "Investment firm faces regulatory scrutiny." I clicked on the last one, dated about 6 months after my conviction. The article loaded, and my breath caught in my throat. Halfway down the page was a photo I recognized instantly: Ethan Murphy, hurrying from a courthouse, hand raised to block the camera, his familiar profile turning away. The caption read, "Sullivan Investments CEO Ethan Murphy leaves federal court after questioning related to alleged financial irregularities." The article detailed suspicious activities at Sullivan Investments in Boston, mentioning patterns of discrepancies in charitable foundation accounts and employees who had taken the fall for larger corporate misconduct. Though it didn't name me directly, one paragraph referenced a former financial analyst serving time for embezzlement from the Brighter Tomorrow Foundation, a case that sources suggest may warrant reopening in light of similar patterns at Sullivan Investments. My hands trembled as I opened a new tab and searched more specifically, "Lucas Gray, Ethan Murphy." 3 more articles appeared, each digging deeper into Ethan's company and its pattern of questionable practices. The most recent, dated just 2 months ago, mentioned his expansion to Hartford and New Haven markets. Cold clarity washed over me. Lucas Gray hadn't struck up conversations because he enjoyed my company or found me interesting. He'd been investigating me all along, hoping I'd reveal information about Ethan without realizing his real agenda. The books, the coffee, the hikes, all tactics to get me talking about my past. I shut my laptop, my sanctuary suddenly feeling exposed. The carefully constructed walls I'd built around my new life had been infiltrated with such apparent ease. With a few casual conversations and coffee dates, he'd collected more information about me than I'd shared with anyone since my release. I grabbed my phone and typed a quick message. Can't make Sleeping Giant next week. Schedule changed. Thanks for understanding. I hit send, then blocked his number. My body felt heavy as I moved through my evening routine on autopilot, washing my face, brushing my teeth, changing into the oversized t-shirt I slept in. The small studio apartment that had felt like a safe haven now seemed vulnerable, its locks insufficient against the kind of invasion Lucas Gray had performed. Not breaking in, but being invited. I pulled the blackout curtains closed, checking twice to ensure no gaps remained. Tomorrow I would tell Rita I couldn't work morning shifts anymore. I'd change my walking routes. I'd be more careful about what I revealed in casual conversation. Trust no one. My mantra echoed back to me, mocking the momentary weakness that had allowed me to forget it. Lucas Gray wasn't interested in Emily Collins, the quiet barista with a knack for remembering orders. He wanted Emily Wilson, the woman convicted of financial fraud, the woman connected to Ethan Murphy. I'd been a fool once before. I pulled the covers over me in the darkened room, curling around the hollow feeling in my chest. The coffee mugs, the book recommendations, the patient conversations, all part of a strategy to use me for a story. Never again. I scraped ice from the inside of my window with the edge of a credit card. November in New Haven meant mornings where the cold seeped through glass and brick as if they were paper. My breath fogged in front of my face even inside the apartment. The radiator beneath the window knocked and hissed, fighting a losing battle against the chill. 2 weeks had passed since I'd blocked Lucas's number and changed my schedule at the cafe. Rita had asked once why I'd switched to afternoon shifts. I'd mumbled something about online classes in the mornings. She'd nodded, no questions asked. Another reason I appreciated her. I pulled on layers, thermal shirt, sweater, the wool coat I'd found at Goodwill for $12. My routine had narrowed to an even smaller circuit. Apartment to cafe to night classes at the community college computer lab, then straight back to my apartment. No parks, no detours, no conversations beyond what was necessary for work. The hallway outside my door smelled of someone's burnt toast and the pine cleaner the landlord used sporadically. I locked my door, testing the handle twice before heading toward the stairs. 3 flights down, each step groaning under my weight. The lobby's flickering fluorescent light cast everything in a sickly yellow glow. I pushed through the building's front door into air that bit at my exposed skin. Frost crunched under my boots as I started down the sidewalk, head ducked against the wind. I'd have to catch the bus today, too cold to walk the mile to campus for my accounting lab. A figure leaned against the brick wall beside the building's entrance. My steps faltered when I recognized the horn-rimmed glasses, the weathered messenger bag, the familiar stance. Lucas Gray straightened when he saw me, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I considered my options. Turn back into the building, cross the street, pretend I hadn't seen him. All required more energy than I had this morning. Instead, I pulled my scarf higher over my face and kept walking, aiming to pass him without acknowledgement. "Emily," he said, stepping directly into my path. I tried to sidestep around him, but he shifted to block me again. "Move, Lucas." My voice came muffled through my scarf. "I know about Ethan Murphy," he said, keeping his voice low despite the empty street. "And I know you're innocent." The words hit like a physical blow. I glanced around frantically, no one nearby, but still. My heart hammered against my ribs. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm, fingers digging into his wool coat, and yanked him through the building's entrance into the lobby. The door swung shut behind us with a dull thud. The lobby wasn't much warmer than outside, but at least we were out of the wind and away from potential eavesdroppers. I released his arm and backed away 2 steps, keeping distance between us. "How long have you known who I am?" I demanded, tugging my scarf down. Lucas pulled off his glasses, wiping condensation from the lenses with the edge of his scarf. Without them, his face looked different, more vulnerable, his eyes squinting slightly to focus on me. "Since before we met," he said, replacing the glasses and meeting my gaze directly. "I was investigating Ethan's company for fraud when your case made headlines 2 years ago. Something about your conviction didn't add up." The radiator in the corner clanked and wheezed, filling the silence as I processed his words. "So you tracked me down." The realization settled cold and heavy in my stomach. Found where I worked, pretended to be just another customer, built, whatever this was, all to get a story. At first, yes. He didn't soften the admission, didn't try to dress it up. I tracked you to New Haven after your release. I wanted to hear your side. So I'm just another story? The hurt sliced through my carefully built walls, finding cracks I hadn't even known existed. All those conversations, the hike, the books, just tactics to get me talking. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed. Mrs. Petrova's terrier barked once, twice, then fell silent. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing in odd angles. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes visible even in the bad lighting. "You were," he said finally, "until I got to know you." I laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the empty lobby. "That's what men like you say. That's what Ethan said too, right before he—" "I'm not Ethan," Lucas cut in, his voice tight. "And I can prove it. I have evidence that supports your innocence. Bank records showing transfers you couldn't have made while you were out of the country. Documentation of similar fraud patterns at other charitable foundations connected to Sullivan Investments." My anger faltered, curiosity pushing through. "How did you get those?" "I've been investigating Ethan for nearly 3 years. I've interviewed former employees, tracked financial records, followed paper trails across 3 states. He paused, hands dropping to his sides. "I need your help to finish the investigation, to bring him down, to clear your name." I studied his face, looking for the tells I'd learned to recognize. The slight tension around the eyes when someone lied. The too perfect stillness of someone playing a role. Lucas met my gaze, his eyes clear behind his glasses. A door creaked open upstairs. Footsteps sounded on the landing. The lobby suddenly felt too exposed. "Upstairs," I said abruptly. "We can't talk here." I led him up the narrow staircase, each step complaining under our weight. The hallway on the 3rd floor smelled of cooking oil and mildew. I unlocked my apartment door, pushing it open to reveal my small, Spartan space. Lucas stepped inside, his broad shoulders making the studio seem even smaller. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, taking in the twin bed with its hospital corners, the folding table with its single chair, the kitchenette with 2 plates stacked neatly by the sink. No photos, no decorations, nothing personal except a stack of accounting textbooks on the windowsill. "You can sit," I said, gesturing to the folding chair while I perched on the edge of the bed. "Talk." Lucas sat, the metal chair creaking beneath him. "How much do you know about what happened? About how Ethan framed you?" "Enough to know I was set up." I paused, then made a decision. "Wait." I moved to the corner of the room and knelt beside the baseboard heater. With practiced fingers, I pried loose a section of the metal cover, reaching into the space behind it. The brown envelope I pulled out was worn from handling, its edges soft from countless nights of examination. "What most people don't know about prison," I said, returning to sit on the bed, "is how much time you have to think, to remember, to piece things together." I emptied the envelope's contents onto the blanket between us, photocopies of bank statements, printouts of emails, handwritten notes on scraps of paper. The collection looked pitiful, nothing like the organized evidence files shown in courtroom dramas. But it represented 2 years of mental reconstruction, of moments remembered and connections made. During my relationship with Ethan, I saw things, signed things. I picked through the papers, arranging them by date. Most of it seemed normal at the time. Routine financial documents for the foundation, transfer authorizations, audit approvals. But in prison, I started remembering details, dates that didn't match, signatures that weren't quite right, transactions that happened when I was visiting my parents. I picked up one paper, a photocopy of a transaction record with my notes scribbled in the margins. "This transfer to an offshore account in the Caymans, the date stamp shows it happened while Ethan and I were in Nantucket. I couldn't have been at the office computer they claimed I used." Lucas leaned forward, examining the document without touching it. "May I?" I nodded, and he carefully lifted the paper, studying my notations. "Ethan has done this before," he said, eyes still on the document. "His company, Sullivan Investments in Boston, has a pattern of hiring trusted employees who later take falls for financial crimes." He reached into his messenger bag and removed a folder, opening it on his lap. There was Andrea Winters in 2015, charged with embezzlement from a scholarship fund managed by Sullivan, then Michael Porter in 2017, cooking the books for a client's private foundation, both convicted, both maintaining their innocence. He handed me a newspaper clipping with a photo of a woman being led from a courthouse. her face a mask of shock and disbelief. I recognized that expression, had seen it in my own reflection during those first weeks of incarceration. The paper felt brittle between my fingers, its edges worn from handling. "I've spoken with Andrea," Lucas continued. "Her case mirrors yours. Sullivan Investments managed the scholarship fund's finances. She signed papers without scrutinizing them, trusted Ethan's guidance. When money disappeared, her signature was on all the incriminating documents." The familiarity of the story made my stomach clench. The weak morning light filtered through my thin curtains, casting Lucas's face in soft shadow. I gathered my papers, sliding them back into the envelope with hands that had steadied. The manila paper felt rough against my fingertips, comforting in its tangibility. Why me? The question had haunted me for 2 years. Why did he pick me to take the fall? From what I've pieced together, Ethan selects people with specific traits: intelligent, trustworthy, somewhat isolated. People without extensive family networks or deep professional connections who might investigate too thoroughly. People who trust him implicitly. The description stung with its accuracy. I had been all those things: a dedicated financial analyst with few close friends, estranged from extended family, trusting Ethan completely. The perfect patsy. "What's your angle in all this?" I asked, careful to keep my voice neutral. "You get a big story, advance your career. What do I get except reopened wounds?" "You get your name cleared." Lucas closed his folder and set it aside. "You get your professional reputation back. You get justice. And if I'm not interested, then I walk out that door and you never see me again." His voice remained level, but something flickered in his eyes. Disappointment, perhaps. "But I don't think that's what you want. Not after keeping those." He nodded toward the envelope in my hands. He was right. Those papers represented more than evidence. They were a promise I'd made to myself during the darkest nights in prison. A promise that someday, somehow, I would clear my name. I would make Ethan pay for what he'd done to me. The radiator knocked again, a metallic sound that punctuated the silence. Outside, the wind pressed against my window, finding the gaps in the old frame. The cold air seeped in despite the heat, a reminder of how fragile barriers could be. "I want my name cleared," I said finally, meeting his gaze. "But I need to know, is this still just a story to you?" The question hung between us, heavy with everything unspoken: his deception, my distrust, the careful connection we'd been building before I discovered his true purpose. Lucas looked at me, really looked at me, his expression more open than I'd ever seen it. "No," he answered. "This is about justice, and maybe something more." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't sure I ever would be. Instead, I slid the envelope across the bed toward him. "Then let's get to work." December coated New Haven in frost and falling snow, transforming my small studio into something almost cozy by comparison. The radiator beneath my window hissed and clanked with renewed purpose, fighting off the chill that pressed against the glass. 2 laptops now occupied my folding table, mine and Lucas's, surrounded by stacks of papers, notebooks, and empty coffee mugs that multiplied despite my best efforts to keep things orderly. "Andrea confirmed the transfer dates," Lucas said, pushing his glasses up as he squinted at his screen. "Her timeline matches yours almost exactly. A major donation coming in, paperwork she signed without thorough review, and then the discovery of missing funds 3 months later." I nodded, adding another note to our growing timeline taped to my wall. The once bare space had transformed into an evidence board over the past 2 weeks: dates, names, and transaction records connected by red string I'd bought from the craft store down the street. It looked like something from a detective movie, but it helped us visualize the patterns emerging from Ethan's operations. "What about Michael Porter?" I asked, uncapping a marker with my teeth before adding Andrea's confirmation to our notes. "Has he responded to your email?" "Not yet. His parole officer says he's working construction in Vermont now, mostly off the grid." Lucas stretched, his shoulders popping audibly in the quiet room. "We need to be patient." Patience wasn't my strong suit anymore. Not with this. Not when I could finally see a path toward clearing my name. But I nodded anyway, capping the marker and stepping back to examine our wall of evidence. It was still thin: circumstantial connections, timing discrepancies, patterns that any decent defense attorney could dismiss as coincidence. We needed something concrete, something that tied Ethan directly to the fraudulent transactions he'd blamed on me. "I think we need to contact Sarah," I said, turning to face Lucas. He looked up from his laptop, eyebrows raised. "Your old colleague? The one you said wouldn't talk to your lawyer during the trial?" She was scared. Ethan had just fired her after I was arrested, claimed she was part of the problem, but she was the only other person with direct access to those financial records. I paced the narrow path between my bed and the table. If we can get her to confirm that Ethan had electronic authorization capabilities, or that the signature stamps didn't always require my physical presence. "It's worth a try," Lucas agreed. "But be prepared for her to refuse. People who've been burned by association don't usually jump at the chance to get involved again." His words carried the weight of experience. I'd learned over the past weeks that Lucas had approached dozens of potential sources during his 3-year investigation, many of whom had slammed doors in his face, literally or figuratively. His persistence was something I'd come to admire, and something I hoped to borrow for myself. "I'll call her tomorrow," I decided, glancing at the clock. "Past midnight already. We should stop for tonight." Lucas nodded, closing his laptop but making no move to leave. This had become our routine, working late into the night, then pausing awkwardly at this exact moment, neither of us quite sure how to end the evening. The dance of two people learning to navigate a partnership neither had anticipated. "You know," he said, his voice softer than it had been all evening, "it's been almost a month since we started this. We're making real progress." I looked at our evidence wall, trying to see it through fresh eyes. What had begun as scattered notes had evolved into something substantial, a framework for understanding how Ethan operated, the patterns he followed when selecting and framing his victims. It wasn't enough yet, but it was no longer nothing. "We are," I agreed, allowing myself a small moment of hope. "Thank you for believing me when no one else did." Lucas smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes behind his glasses. "I'm a journalist. Suspicion is my default setting." That pulled a genuine laugh from me, a sound that still felt strange in my throat. I'd laughed more in the past month than I had in the 2 years before, small moments of levity breaking through the intensity of our work. "I should go," Lucas said, packing his laptop into his messenger bag. "Early meeting with my editor tomorrow. He thinks I'm spending too much time on this investigation without producing enough copy." "Is he right?" I asked, suddenly concerned that Lucas might be risking his job for this, for me. Lucas paused at the door, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Some stories are worth the time it takes to get them right. After he left, I stared at the evidence wall for a long time, tracing the connections we'd mapped with my eyes. 2 years of my life had been stolen because I trusted the wrong person. Now I was putting my faith in someone else, opening myself to the possibility of being wrong again. The thought should have terrified me, but instead it felt like something closer to courage. January brought bitter cold and a breakthrough. Michael Porter finally responded to Lucas's persistent emails, agreeing to meet us at a diner just across the Vermont border. We drove through snow flurries in Lucas's ancient Subaru, the heater laboring against windows that kept fogging up. I scraped ice from the inside of the passenger window with my credit card, creating a small, clear patch to watch the white landscape scroll past. "You okay?" Lucas asked after nearly an hour of silence. "You've been quiet." "Just thinking." I continued scraping, the ice collecting under my fingernails, about what to say to him, how much to share about my own case. "The truth," Lucas suggested, hand steady on the wheel as we navigated an icy curve. "That's usually the most convincing approach." The diner appeared through the snow like something from another era, a silver railcar structure with neon signs glowing against the white backdrop. Michael was already inside, occupying a corner booth, his back to the wall and eyes on the door. I recognized the posture immediately, the habitual vigilance of someone who'd learned the hard way to watch for threats. "Mr. Porter?" Lucas slid into the booth while I hesitated, then took the seat beside him. "Thanks for meeting us." Michael Porter looked nothing like me, but I recognized everything about him, the way his eyes darted around the diner, assessing exits and potential eavesdroppers, the slight hunch of his shoulders, the way he held his coffee mug with both hands, as if anchoring himself to something solid. Prison changes how you occupy space in the world, how you calculate risks and scan for dangers. I saw my own hypervigilance reflected in his posture, "You said this was about Ethan Murphy," he said, voice low and rough. "About what he did to me." "And to her," Lucas nodded toward me. "Emily Wilson, former financial analyst at the Brighter Tomorrow Foundation." Michael's eyes shifted to me, recognition slowly dawning. "I remember your case. It was in the papers right before I got out." "I was innocent," I said simply. "Just like you claim to be." His laugh held no humor. "Lots of people in prison claim that." "I know," I met his gaze directly. "But we're the ones who actually are. And we can prove it if you help us." The waitress approached, coffee pot in hand. We fell silent as she refilled Michael's mug and poured cups for Lucas and me. The diner's radio played old country music, just loud enough to ensure our conversation wouldn't carry to nearby tables. "What do you want from me?" Michael asked once she'd moved away, his fingers drumming lightly on the table's worn surface. "Your story," Lucas answered. "The details of how you came to work for Sullivan Investments, what your responsibilities were, how the fraud was discovered, what evidence was used against you. And in return?" "Justice," I said before Lucas could answer. "A chance to clear your name, to make sure Ethan Murphy never does this to anyone else." Michael studied me for a long moment, then reached for his worn backpack beside him on the bench. He pulled out a manila folder, edges soft from frequent handling. I recognized it immediately. He'd kept his own evidence, just as I had. "I've been putting this together since I got out," he explained, opening the folder to reveal newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photocopies of financial records. "Didn't know what I'd do with it. Didn't think anyone would believe me." My throat tightened as he spread the contents across the table between us. His collection mirrored my own, the desperate gathering of fragments, hoping someday they might form a whole that someone would recognize as truth. "We believe you," I said simply. Michael nodded once, then began to talk. For the next 3 hours, he walked us through his time at Sullivan Investments, his hiring as a financial advisor, his assignment to manage the books for a private education foundation, the gradual increase in responsibility that came with Ethan's apparent trust. The pattern matched my experience so perfectly it made my skin crawl. "Here's what doesn't make sense," Michael said, pointing to a transaction record. "This withdrawal happened during the company retreat in the Berkshires. Everyone was required to attend. Team building or some bullshit. I was playing paintball when this money supposedly moved from the foundation to a shell company in Panama." Lucas took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification on dates or account details. I sat quietly, watching Michael's face as he recounted his story, the bewilderment, the anger, the lingering disbelief that someone he'd trusted could have betrayed him so completely. "Did you ever confront Ethan directly?" I asked during a pause. Michael's expression darkened. "Once, after my arraignment, I called him from the holding cell, asked him why he'd done this to me." He stared into his coffee. "Know what he said? 'It's just business, Mike, nothing personal.'" The words struck me like a physical blow. Cold, calculated betrayal framed as mere business necessity. It fit everything I knew about Ethan, his ability to compartmentalize, to discard people who no longer served his purposes. "We need to connect all 3 cases," Lucas said as we prepared to leave. "Find the common threads, the signature methods. It's not enough to show that each of you couldn't have conducted the fraud. We need to prove that Ethan could, and did." Michael hesitated before sliding his folder across the table to us. "Take copies of whatever helps. Just be careful. He has resources, connections. He'll fight back if he feels threatened." I knew he was right. Ethan wouldn't go down without a battle, and he wouldn't fight fair. But for the first time since my conviction, I felt something like strength gathering inside me, not just my own, but the collected strength of others who shared my experience. 3 victims working together might accomplish what one alone could not. As we left the diner, snow swirling around us in the parking lot, Michael caught my arm. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Why not just move on, start over somewhere new?" I thought about my small apartment in New Haven, my quiet life at the cafe, the careful boundaries I'd constructed to protect myself from further harm. Starting over had been my plan. It would have been easier, safer. "Because he shouldn't get away with it," I said simply. "Because the truth matters." Michael nodded once, understanding passing between us. Then he turned and walked toward his truck, shoulders hunched against the cold, carrying the weight of injustice like a physical burden. February brought gray skies and a crucial call from Sarah Whitman, my former colleague at the Brighter Tomorrow Foundation. After weeks of unreturned messages, she'd finally agreed to speak with me, not in person, but over the phone, with Lucas recording the conversation for his article. "I can't talk long," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "I signed an NDA when they let me go." "I understand," I reassured her. "I just need clarification on a few procedural matters." I kept my questions technical, focusing on the mundane details of office operations rather than directly implicating Ethan. How were electronic signatures authorized? Who had access to the financial software? What was the review process for large transfers? "The electronic signature system was linked to our network logins," Sarah explained. "Anyone with your password could authorize transactions under your name." "And was my password ever shared for administrative purposes?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the significance of where this line of questioning led. A pause. "Yes. It had a master list of all employee credentials for system maintenance, and Ethan sometimes had us share logins when he needed to approve something urgently while traveling." I caught Lucas's eye across my kitchen table. This was it, the technical vulnerability that would have allowed Ethan to execute transactions under my credentials. Not proof that he had done so, but evidence that he could have. "Sarah, this is really important," I pressed. "Do you remember any specific instances when Ethan used my login to authorize transactions while I was unavailable?" Another longer pause. "I shouldn't be telling you this. Please, Sarah, my entire life was destroyed." A deep breath from the other end of the line. "Yes, at least twice. Once when you had food poisoning and missed 2 days of work, and again during your vacation to visit your parents in Michigan." My hands shook as I wrote down the dates. Both coincided with substantial fraudulent transfers that had been attributed to me during my trial. If we could prove I couldn't physically have been at my computer— "Would you be willing to provide a sworn statement to that effect?" Lucas asked, speaking for the first time since the call began. I don't know," Sarah hesitated. "Ethan has friends in the industry. I could lose my current job." "We understand," I said quickly. "But if it came to a formal investigation by the FBI rather than just a journalist's article, would you tell them the truth?" "Yes," she said after a moment. "If legally required, I would tell the truth." After the call ended, Lucas and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing what we'd learned. This was the connection we'd been missing. The technical explanation for how Ethan could have executed fraudulent transactions under my name. Combined with the timeline inconsistencies and the pattern demonstrated across multiple victims, we finally had enough to take the story public. "I think we're ready," Lucas said, gathering his notes. "I can have the first draft of the article done by the weekend." I nodded, feeling strangely hollow despite the breakthrough. For 2 months, our investigation had given me purpose, channeling my anger into productive action. Now that we were approaching the end, uncertainty crept back in. What would happen when the article was published? Would anyone in authority care enough to reopen my case? Would Ethan find a way to escape consequences yet again? "What if it's not enough?" I asked quietly. Lucas set down his pen, looking at me directly. "It might not be. Not at first. These kinds of cases take time, especially when the perpetrator has resources and connections. But it's a start. It puts the evidence in the public record. It connects the dots that no one bothered to connect before. And if nothing happens, then we keep pushing. We take it to the FBI directly. We find more victims. We don't give up." His voice carried absolute conviction. "I promise you, Emily, I won't stop until your name is cleared." I studied his face, searching for any trace of doubt or deception. I'd become an expert at detecting lies, at finding the subtle tells that revealed a person's true intentions. I found none in Lucas's steady gaze. "Okay," I said. "Let's do it." Lucas's exposé hit the front page of the Hartford Courier on a Sunday morning in late February. Pattern of fraud, CEO frames, employees for financial crimes, blazed across the top of the page, with Ethan's corporate headshot featured prominently beside it. The subheading named all 3 victims, Andrea Winters, Michael Porter, and me, and outlined the striking similarities in our cases. The article detailed the technical vulnerabilities in Sullivan Investments systems, the timeline inconsistencies, and the pattern of targeting trusted employees with limited support networks. It stopped short of directly accusing Ethan of committing the crimes himself, couching its conclusions in careful journalistic language about raising serious questions and warranting further investigation. But anyone reading between the lines would understand the implication. I picked up my copy from a newsstand near my apartment, hands trembling slightly as I paid the vendor. The weight of the paper felt significant in my hands, tangible evidence that my story had finally been told. My phone rang just after noon, an unfamiliar number with a Boston area code. Miss Wilson? This is Special Agent Daniels with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We've read this morning's article in the Courier. We'd like to speak with you about your case. The meeting was scheduled for the following day. Lucas drove me to the FBI field office in New Haven, the car ride passing in tense silence. This was the moment everything hinged on. Whether federal authorities would take our evidence seriously or dismiss it as the desperate attempts of convicted criminals to clear their names. The interview room was stark and utilitarian. White walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs. Agent Daniels was joined by Agent Reyes, both in dark suits with neutral expressions that revealed nothing about their thoughts on my case. We've reviewed the materials Mr. Gray provided along with his article. Agent Daniels began, opening a thick folder on the table. And we've pulled the original case files from your conviction. Walk us through your version of events, Miss Wilson, from the beginning. For the next 3 hours, I recounted everything. My relationship with Ethan, my work at the foundation, the transactions I had and hadn't authorized, the inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline, the technical vulnerabilities Sarah had confirmed. I answered their questions directly, without embellishment or evasion. Agent Reyes took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific dates or amounts. Agent Daniels watched me with an unreadable expression, offering no indication of whether he believed me. We'll be speaking with Miss Winters and Mr. Porter as well, he said as the interview concluded. And we've requested access to Sullivan Investments' financial records for the periods in question. Will the case be reopened? I asked, trying to keep the desperate hope from my voice. That decision hasn't been made yet, Agent Daniels replied, his professional mask firmly in place. But I can tell you we're taking these allegations very seriously. Financial fraud involving charitable foundations is a priority for our unit. It wasn't the definitive answer I'd hoped for, but it was more than I'd had in 2 years, official acknowledgement that my claims deserved investigation. As Lucas and I left the building, a weight I'd carried since my arrest felt incrementally lighter. That went well, Lucas said as we walked to his car. They were engaged, asking the right questions. They wouldn't commit that kind of time if they weren't seriously considering reopening the case. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Hope was a dangerous thing after so long without it. I'd learned to protect myself by expecting the worst, preparing for disappointment rather than allowing myself to anticipate justice. But over the next few weeks, evidence mounted that this time might be different. The FBI interviewed Andrea and Michael. They served subpoenas on Sullivan Investments for records related to all 3 cases. They brought Sarah in for formal questioning about the electronic signature system. And then, 6 weeks after the article was published, Agent Daniels called with news. A federal judge had granted their request to reopen my case based on new evidence. We'll need you to testify again, he explained, and there's no guarantee of the outcome. But we believe we have enough to present a compelling case for your innocence and to pursue charges against Mr. Murphy. The hearing was scheduled for April 15th in the same Boston courthouse where I'd been convicted 2 years earlier. The date loomed on my calendar, both thrilling and terrifying. I took a leave of absence from the cafe, pouring all my energy into preparing with the federal prosecutors who now believed my story. Lucas continued his investigation, publishing follow-up articles as new details emerged about other potential victims of Ethan's scheme. He attended every preparation session with me, taking notes and offering encouragement when the process became overwhelming. The night before the hearing, we sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by case files and takeout containers. The evidence wall had grown so extensive it now wrapped around 2 corners, with red string connecting dozens of documents in a complex web of fraud. No matter what happens tomorrow, Lucas said, closing the folder he'd been reviewing, you've already won. You've fought back. You've told your truth. I looked at him across the scattered papers between us, this man who had entered my life under false pretenses, but had become my most steadfast ally. Trust still didn't come easily to me, but I'd learned to recognize when it was deserved. "We fought back," I corrected him. "I couldn't have done this alone." His smile in response held something beyond professional satisfaction, a warmth that had been growing between us during these months of shared purpose and proximity. Neither of us had acknowledged it directly, both tacitly agreeing to focus on clearing my name before considering what might come after. "Try to get some sleep," he advised, gathering his things to leave. "Tomorrow's a big day." Sleep proved elusive. I lay awake for hours, replaying the events that had led me here, from my conviction to prison to rebuilding a careful life in New Haven to partnership with Lucas, and now to the precipice of potential vindication. The journey had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The Boston courthouse loomed against a clear April sky, its stone facade both familiar and nightmarish. My last time here had ended with me in handcuffs, being led away to serve a sentence for crimes I didn't commit. Lucas stood beside me at the base of the wide steps, solid and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked. I took a deep breath, straightening my shoulders. "Ready." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low conversation. Federal prosecutors arranged papers at their table. Journalists filled the back rows. Lucas's article had sparked wider media interest in the case. And there, at the defense table, sat Ethan Murphy. He looked much as I remembered, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark hair styled perfectly, his posture confident despite the circumstances. When he turned and saw me enter, his expression flickered briefly, surprise perhaps or concern quickly masked by his usual composure. "Ignore him," Lucas murmured beside me. "He's not worth your attention." But I couldn't look away. This man had stolen 2 years of my life, destroyed my career, damaged relationships with my family, all to protect himself. Seeing him now in the flesh, rather than in memories or nightmares, made the reality of what he'd done freshly painful. The hearing proceeded with the formal precision of legal proceedings. The federal prosecutor presented the new evidence, the electronic signature vulnerabilities, the timeline discrepancies proven through travel records and witness statements, the pattern established across multiple victims. I testified again, calmly recounting the events surrounding the fraudulent transactions and explaining why I couldn't have executed them. Throughout my testimony, I felt Ethan's eyes on me, calculating and cold. I didn't look at him directly, focusing instead on answering the questions clearly and confidently. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about the truth. Sarah testified next, confirming that Ethan had used my login credentials during periods when I was absent from the office, exactly when several of the fraudulent transfers occurred. Her voice shook slightly, but her testimony was clear and damning. The technical evidence proved most compelling, records showing that my computer couldn't have been used for transactions executed while I was demonstrably elsewhere, backed by cell phone location data and eyewitness accounts. The prosecution had built a meticulous case that left little room for reasonable doubt. When the judge finally spoke, her voice cut through the tension in the courtroom like a blade. "Based on the substantial new evidence presented, I find that a grave miscarriage of justice has occurred. The conviction of Emily Wilson is hereby vacated, and all charges against her are dismissed with prejudice." She turned her attention to Ethan, her expression hardening. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate arrest of Ethan Murphy on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. Mr. Murphy will be remanded into custody, pending arraignment." The words seemed to hang in the air, almost too momentous to absorb. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter what I was hearing. Beside me, Lucas reached over and squeezed my hand once, gentle but firm. 2 federal marshals approached Ethan, who had gone very still, his face a rigid mask. As they handcuffed him, the same procedure I had endured 2 years ago, his eyes found mine across the courtroom. For the briefest moment, his composed facade cracked, revealing the rage and fear beneath. Then he was being led away, just as I had been. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, but it brought no satisfaction, only a profound relief that the truth had finally prevailed. Outside on the courthouse steps, journalists clustered with cameras and microphones. Lucas shielded me from the most aggressive questions as we made our way down to the street. "You did this," he said quietly once we'd escaped the worst of the media scrum. "Your determination, your memory for details, your refusal to give up, that's what made this happen." "We did," I corrected him again, meeting his gaze. "I wouldn't be here without you believing me first." The April sun warmed my face as we walked away from the courthouse. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of injustice lifting from my shoulders, allowing me to stand straight and breathe freely. Spring blossomed in New Haven with an explosion of color and fragrance. The cherry trees that lined my street burst into pale pink clouds, dropping petals that swirled in the breeze and stuck to wet sidewalks after rain. My small apartment felt different now, no longer a temporary hiding place, but the beginning of something more permanent. The weeks following the hearing brought a flood of changes. My parents called, tearful and apologetic for having doubted me. The conversation was awkward and painful, but it opened a door that had been firmly closed for years. Reconciliation would take time, but it now seemed possible in a way it hadn't before. Job offers arrived from financial firms who had read about my case. My wrongful conviction had become a strange kind of credential, proof of my integrity in the face of extreme pressure. I interviewed with 3 companies, ultimately accepting a position as a financial analyst with a firm in Hartford that specialized in ethical investment strategies. Lucas continued his investigative work, now focused on building a larger case connecting all of Ethan's victims. His follow-up articles earned him professional recognition and a promotion at the Courier. We celebrated with dinner at an Italian restaurant near the harbor, toasting with red wine that tasted like possibility. Through it all, our relationship evolved cautiously. The intensity of our shared mission had created a bond neither of us fully understood yet. We met for coffee outside the cafe where I no longer worked. We walked in East Rock Park on weekends. We talked about books and music and politics rather than fraud and evidence. We were learning each other anew, without the pressure of investigation driving our connection. One evening in May, Lucas came to my apartment for dinner, a simple meal I'd prepared to thank him for everything he'd done. The evidence wall had been dismantled, the red string and documents packed away in boxes headed for storage. The space felt cleaner, lighter, ready for new memories to fill it. We sat by the open window, listening to distant traffic and the conversations of neighbors enjoying the warm evening on their stoops. The remnants of our meal, pasta with fresh tomato sauce, crusty bread, a half-empty bottle of wine, cluttered the folding table. "What comes next for you?" Lucas asked, leaning back in his chair. "Beyond the new job?" I considered the question, swirling the wine in my glass. "I'm not sure yet. Rebuild, I guess. Find an apartment in Hartford. Reconnect with old friends who might still be willing to know me. Figure out who I am now, after everything." "And us?" he asked quietly, the question hanging between us. "What comes next for us?" I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the familiar features that had become dear to me over these months. The horn-rimmed glasses, the thoughtful eyes behind them, the way one corner of his mouth lifted slightly when he was uncertain. "I'm still learning how to trust," I admitted. "Not just others, myself too, my judgment, my instincts. I know." His voice was gentle, without pressure. "But I want to try," I continued, setting my glass down. "Not all at once, not with blind faith, but day by day with open eyes." He nodded, understanding in his expression. "That's all anyone can ask for, day by day." The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming trees through the window, fresh and sweet with the promise of new growth. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Car doors slamming, distant laughter, music drifting from an open apartment window down the street. Life, moving forward. I reached across the table and took his hand in mine, feeling the warmth of his skin against my palm. "Thank you for believing me when no one else would." His fingers curled around mine, solid and real. "Thank you for being brave enough to fight back." We sat there as twilight deepened into evening, our hands linked on the table between half-empty plates and wine glasses catching the last of the day's light. There was no rush, no pressure to define what we were becoming. We had time now, time to build something careful and honest, founded not on desperate need, but on mutual respect and shared understanding. Trust, like healing, happens day by day, and for the first time in years, I had days stretching before me full of possibility rather than fear. Whatever came next, I would face it with open eyes, and the knowledge that truth, eventually, finds its way to light.